All right. Welcome, everyone, to this week's Autonomy Talk. This week is a pleasure to have with us Professor Spring Berman, who is an associate professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering at Arizona State University. She moved to Pennsylvania, where she obtained her master's and her PhD degrees in mechanical engineering and applied mechanics. And then she spent some time at Harvard as a postdoctoral researcher. Broadly, her research focuses on the design of control strategies for robotic swarms, soft continuum robots, and distributed human autonomy teams. Today, she's going to talk about scalable control of robotic swarms in uncertain environments. As you might read from the title, this fits very well the scope of this series, and therefore I'm very excited to hear more about the topic. Without further ado, I give you the stage, Spring.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to talk. Yes, so I'm going to be talking about my group's research in control strategies for robotic swarms in uncertain environments. And when I talk about robotic swarms, I'm referring to large collectives of robots that are programmed to perform some complex task as a collective. And so as the technology has advanced in robotics, now it's become more feasible to deploy these large numbers of relatively inexpensive platforms. And as you can see here, there's been a number of projects in research and also in industry on developing swarms for various applications, including defense, environmental monitoring, logistics, like Amazon Robotics and their automated warehouses, agriculture, and even entertainment in terms of aerial vehicles. So given that there's a number of possible uses for robotic swarms, the problem that we consider in my lab is how do we control them in a way that's scalable, meaning it doesn't get more complex to control the robots as the number of robots increases, and how can we ensure that their performance is reliable and that they perform the expected collective behavior. And so we consider scenarios with various challenges. Oftentimes a swarm will need to operate in denied and inaccessible environments. So environments that can't be instrumented, that lack access to GPS, and that have possibly limited communication bandwidth and frequent communication dropouts. And oftentimes the robots will not have prior data about the environment that they can use to help them navigate. And so some examples of such applications might be underwater, subterranean, moving through dense urban environments, search and rescue, disaster response. And another challenge is that we want the swarm to perform robustly in the presence of robot errors and failures. And we want them to often operate over long timescales. So meaning that they, even though some robots might fail, there's uncertainties and stochasticity in their environment, we still want the swarm to persist and complete its mission. So given these challenges, we often look to systems in nature which have overcome these challenges to perform complex tasks as collectives. And there are many examples in biology of swarms, for instance, of social insect colonies like ants, honeybees, some species of termites. And so some of the behaviors you see here are swarms that are selecting a new nest site or building, in the case of the termites, this massive nest, which is several times taller than a human, moving a payload, in this case, a food item, collectively back to their nest. And then we also see behaviors like flocking and schooling, where the individuals display this coordinated motion, even though there's no leader that's telling them where to go. And even in embryonic development, in the organization of cells within a developing organism. So one thing that these many of these natural swarms have in common is that the individuals in the swarm behave in what's called a decentralized manner. So they are just responding to local information that they gather via sensing or possibly communication with their neighbors. They are, the behaviors are often robust to changes in the number of agents or individuals. And they're operating, or they're doing their task in many different types of environments. They don't have a map necessarily beforehand of the environment. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty, and they don't always perform the same routine in a deterministic fashion. They have some flexibility in how they respond to situations. And so their behaviors often can be modeled as stochastic. So, so we want to adopt some of these properties when we design control strategies for robotic swarms, and also make sure that we have theoretical guarantees on the performance of the swarm, and that it can adapt to changing conditions and objectives. So in terms of systems comprised of multiple robots, we need to consider several factors, including the control architecture and the sensing and communication framework. And so there are different ways to organize a multi-robot control architecture. You can have a centralized architecture in which there's a single controller that is computing the commands for each individual robot, but that's not going to be very scalable as the number of robots increases in order to assign, you know, each individual their next actions. You can also have distributed and decentralized strategies, which are more suitable for large numbers of robots, in which the robots may be locally controlling sections of the swarm and communicating with each other, or each robot is just using its own onboard computer to decide what to do next in a completely autonomous fashion. And so we often use this decentralized architecture to ensure good scalability for large numbers. So in terms of communication, many existing strategies rely on some guarantees on connectivity among the agents in terms of their communication network. Most of our strategies don't rely on that. In nature, you don't often see, you know, a continuously connected communication or sensing network. So sometimes we will rely on local sensing. That is that the communication network is or local sensing or communication. So the communication or sensing network is changing over time as the robots move around and they're just communicating or sensing within a local range. Or many of our strategies don't use any communication at all. So one way in which robots are not like individual members of a natural swarm is that we can instrument them with, you know, various sensors, and so we want to be able to take advantage of that. And in cases where it's possible, we might also want to take advantage of an overhead view of the arena in which the robots are performing. And So we might use a centralized sensor in terms of like an overhead camera, some global view of the environment. But often we will not have that capability. So I'm going to describe several different applications for swarms for which we've designed control strategies. And so these include spatial coverage by the swarm, so including interiors and boundaries of regions of interest, task allocation of the swarm among a set of tasks, which is, our strategies are closely related to those for spatial coverage, as you'll see, sensing and control, where possible, of environmental fields, collision-free navigation, mapping obstacles and features of interest, and finally, collective payload transport. So I'm going to start with the first three, and for these three types of applications, we use a multi-level modeling method that enables us to control the density of the swarm over space and possibly time. So here we use a paradigm that's borrowed from the literature on chemical reaction networks and statistical physics, where we consider swarms in which the robots have stochastic behaviors. And an example is shown here in this video of small robots moving around, picking up pieces in an arena, and they have a pre-programmed assembly plan. So when they encounter a robot that's carrying a compatible piece according to the plan, then they will stochastically decide to combine their pieces until they have the one of two full assemblies, which they then drop on the ground. So we can consider this a well-mixed swarm in the sense that the density of robots and parts is spatially homogeneous. And so because we can have an arbitrary number of robots and parts, again, we want this to be our control strategy to be scalable. And so if we look at a model of individuals, which is referred to as a microscopic model, that working with that model is going to involve increasing simulation times with increasing swarm size, and changing parameters requires simulating under a lot of different conditions, and you don't necessarily get theoretical guarantees using that type of analysis. So instead, using the abstraction framework enabled by the control policies defined by the robots, which are acting similarly to chemically reacting molecules, we can abstract the swarm of individuals to a continuum given by a set of densities, each one describing the density or probability density, alternatively, of a different type of assembly or the robots over space and over time, in this case, not space, because we're modeling this as spatially homogeneous, but we can describe the evolution of these densities according to what's called a macroscopic or mean field model. And this is going to be independent of the swarm size. And of course, we can apply different techniques of analysis, control, and optimization to such a model. And that's going to allow us to design control policies for the individual robots. So of course, not all swarms are going to be well mixed. So we might want to model the spatial distribution as well as the distribution over time. And so in this case, we can model the density fields as being functions of space and time. And these will evolve according to a set of partial differential equations. And so this approach, so involving the modeling at multiple levels, so both the individual robots and modeling them as a continuum, we can use this for control by applying our control techniques to the macroscopic or mean field model, and then mapping the parameters onto the robot controllers. And so in this, this illustration here, the robots are just switching stochastically between two tasks, and they're switching at a rate, a probability rate of this K, this reaction rate constant, or in this case, a transition rate. And so the differential equations describing the fractions of robots over time doing the tasks A and B are given by these simple linear equations. So in this case, the design parameter is K, and we can design K for some objective. So oftentimes we're designing it for a target density field of robots at steady state, or a target density field of some other quantity. And so this, this abstraction framework allows us to use the guarantees at the macroscopic level in order to ensure that in expectation, the swarm is going to perform according to the evolution of the macroscopic model, which we can design via its parameters. And so for more about these types of mean field models, you can look at this recent survey paper by my former student and I. And so we have a similar framework for if we're describing swarms by partial differential equations. In this case, we are modeling the motion of the robots as a combination of a deterministic velocity-driven field plus a random walk modeled as diffusion with a diffusion coefficient. And so now we have these additional parameters, the velocity field and possibly the diffusion coefficient, if we can control the random behavior, the random motion of the robots. In some cases, it might just be inherent randomness in the motion that we can't actually adjust. Okay, so if we look at the mean field models, so we can ensure the swarm performance by guaranteeing various properties of these models mathematically. And two of them that we consider are controllability and stabilizability. And so here, controllability refers to the property that the system is controllable if given a initial condition X naught. In this case, this is a differential equation model, ordinary differential equations. For every desired final state, there exists some control input U such that the solution to this ODE model satisfies these conditions. So you end up at the time t at your desired end state, which again is going to be some desired distribution of robots among different states. Stabilizability refers to the property that the system is stabilizable if given some desired steady state distribution XD. There exists a map K such that in the closed loop system that state XD is asymptotically stable. So the key idea here is that we want to design our control inputs. And so we can divide these control inputs into two types that we consider in particular. So in one, they're called state feedback control laws, in which each agent just requires knowledge of its current state, not any of its neighboring, not any of the other agent states. We could also design mean field feedback control laws, also known as density or ensemble feedback control laws, which are functions of the densities of robots in different states. And so now the robots would be using local feedback to decide whether or not to switch states or to decide what their velocity is, for example. And so using this richer class of control inputs allows us to achieve a broader class of desired equilibrium densities for the swarm. So, so we've looked at a number of scenarios of robots that evolve on discrete or continuous spaces that are just switching tasks according to continuous time Markov chains, or also evolving over time according to advection diffusion PDEs. And we've also looked at swarms of robots that are governed by different types of dynamics, and looked at the controllability and stabilization, proved those properties for those swarms. So, and this is also summarized in that survey paper that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so given this overview, now I'll talk a little bit about our approaches to spatial coverage and task allocation that are based on the mean field model. So in this scenario, we have a swarm of robots that has to redistribute itself among a set of tasks. Or alternatively, you can think of them as distributing among a set of spatial locations, discrete locations. And so here we want to design their transition rates such that they have no state switching at equilibrium. So once they reach their equilibrium, the desired equilibrium density, then they will stop moving around between states, which can waste energy and just kind of be unnecessary. And so we've designed their transition rates to be various functions of the local robot populations. In this case, local meaning that they are the populations of robots in states that are adjacent to the robot. And or on the right, this work just used the population at the current state. So they just have to know the number of robots in their current state. And so in the case on the right, we can achieve any target distribution, including ones with 0 robots at some tasks. And so the scalability here is illustrated by the fact that you have 100 states and let's say 10,000 robots start here, and then they redistribute such that you have equal densities in the blue regions and none in the yellow regions. So this is a way to program some simple control policies onto robots, but that will get them to autonomously redistribute among a set of discrete states. So, but maybe your robots are even simpler in that they would need to know their transition rates between different pairs of states in that case, but maybe they don't know where they are. Maybe they can't recognize different pairs of states that they need to switch between. And so we looked at a different strategy in which there is a more sophisticated robot called a leader, which acts kind of like a shepherd or a sheep herding dog with a flock of sheep that basically has a repulsive effect on nearby agents and kind of drives them over time to a desired distribution on the graph. And so here the leader does have localization, the robots do not. The robots can only sense whether the leader is at their state, and the leader can measure the density of robots at that state. So we can construct a sequence of leader state transitions that herds the robots to the target distribution. And the robot transition rates are all the same between each pair of states. They could be also a function of inter-robot interactions if they do have an effect on each other. So here are a couple of movies that show this strategy. So on the left, actually in both cases, the leader is this dot, this red or orange dot, and it's moving through across the graph, and the robots that are in its current square then will probabilistically flee to one of the neighboring squares. And over time, so you can design the leader's transitions to herd the swarm into this target distribution. And so we've also used reinforcement learning techniques as well to design the leader's transitions in the work on the right. Okay, so so far we've looked at scenarios where robots are spontaneously transitioning between different states. But we can also describe mean field models or formulate mean field models that describe interactions between robots and each other, or between robots and some object of interest in the environment. So we've also looked at designing stochastic control policies for boundary coverage, in which the goal is to design these probabilities of attachment to the boundary of a region and detachment from the boundary, given this catalyzing nearby robot, such that we get in expectation, we get a target steady state density of robots around the boundary. And so if the robots recognize different types of boundaries, you can program in different reaction rate constants in order to get different coverage densities around those different regions. And so this kind of looks like an enzymatic chemical reaction network. So this is another possible task that can be programmed using this chemical reaction network mean field model framework. Okay, so now let's add some spatial evolution to the swarm. And so we're going to consider cases where we have this spatially inhomogeneous swarm that's evolving over time. And in this case, the agents are diffusing, and we're modeling a swarm of nanoparticles that are moving or diffusing into a section of tumor tissue. And so there are a set of reactions that govern how the nanoparticles behave, in that they will attach to the receptors in these tumor cancer cells, and they can also detach, and they can be internalized. So once they're internalized, they can release their chemotherapy drug. And if you have a sufficient number of internalized nanoparticles in the cell, then the cell will be killed. So you can formulate this as a reaction diffusion set of equations that describe the nanoparticles and in their different states. And you can design an optimization problem to design a particular parameter, which would be something that you could design for the nanoparticles in order to control their binding rates over space, such that you get a target number of internalized nanoparticles in each of a line of cells. So in this case, we're looking at this as a design problem rather than a control problem. And our design parameter here is this delay in which we imagine that the nanoparticles are shielded by some coating, which is then degraded by maybe an external trigger like light or heat, or maybe it just degrades over time. And at that point, they can bind to receptors and internalize. So this is another type of problem. We can control the spatial distribution of agents over a domain. So we've also looked at applying this mean field control framework to sensing and control of environmental fields. And so I'll talk about a sensing problem first. So in this scenario, we have a scalar environmental field. And we have robots that can take sensor measurements at their location of the value of that scalar field. So we want the swarm to stabilize to a target density where that target density is proportional to the scalar field. And so we're going to design the robot's diffusion coefficient, and we can define it simply as proportional to the inverse square of the field. So as the swarm disperses, it's going to measure the field, and then it's going to control its random motion, such that if the field is higher, it's going to move, they're going to move slower. If it's lower, they'll move faster. And so they're going to end up aggregating at hotspots in this field. And overall, the steady state distribution of the swarm is going to, in a sense, reveal the underlying environmental field. And this was also done in these are superimposed trials because we didn't account for inter-robot collision avoidance, which of course we'd have to do in practice. But using just a single robot, multiple trials, we could show that this control strategy performs as expected. So we can also think about scenarios where the robots are producing some activity and we want to control the distribution of such an activity. And maybe this is something like sensor measurements, or in this particular case, it's pollination activity. So here we imagine a swarm of robotic bees that are deployed over a crop field. And the field has different rows with different cultivars or varieties of the crop. And so we want to control the rate, or rather we want to control the spatial distribution of robot visits to flowers within these crops. And so maybe we, in rows one and row two, we want different levels of pollination activity. So we can design the robots to have this reaction-like effect on visiting the robots. So they have some rate of hovering, deciding to hover at a flower, which depends on the type of flower. And once they hover, then we can record that as a robot visit, which affects pollination. Then they can transition from hovering to flying at some rate k-fly. And we also model their motion as a combination of a controllable velocity field, which can vary with time, and some uncontrollable random motion. And so we can formulate an optimal control problem to compute the velocity field and their rate of hovering, such that we get different distributions of pollination activity over the field. And so we've proved that we can attain a general class of these densities in finite time using bounded control inputs. So here's an example of two different target steady state densities of flower visits. And in the one here in the middle, we want a uniform pollination across all the rows, but there's two different desired densities of pollination between rows 1 and 2. And on the right, we want only the rightmost two rows to be uniformly pollinated. So these, you can see that they don't exactly go to the desired distributions there because there's some fluctuations in the density. And this is typical of these stochastic control strategies. The idea is that if you ran a number of trials and then averaged the resulting densities, they should follow the solution of the corresponding mean field model. But they do give a lot of versatility in terms of the outcome by just changing two parameters of the robot's controllers. And then finally here, we have some more recent work on in the case where you have a swarm of robots that's indirectly affecting an environmental field. And so you're trying to control parameters of the robots in order to achieve a target environmental field, or target spatial density of the field, a target profile over space. And in this case, we're envisioning an underwater swarm with onboard actuators that act as a source in the field, so they can locally increase the field, and we can control the source intensity as well as the robot's velocity. And so we showed that you can indeed control the field in order to achieve various outcomes. For instance, regulating the density of the field in the event that without control, the field would just diffuse to zero everywhere. Okay, so as I mentioned, error, there is going to be some fluctuation around the expected mean field model solution. And so we've done some investigation of quantifying the error between the mean field model that we're using for control and the microscopic model, the densities that evolve from that model. And this was done with our colleague, Andrea Bertozzi, and her student. And so we looked at how we could, for instance, choose the number of robots and their sensing radius to achieve coverage, like in this pollination scenario, within a specified error. And so here we're trying to account for the fact that there is a discrepancy between the mean field model and the microscopic model, and trying to potentially minimize that with the design of our swarm size and their sensing radius. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about collision-free navigation. And so now we're going to move on from the mean field model description to other methods of optimization and control. And we're going to be directly controlling individual robots here, rather than controlling a continuous density field. Okay, so we've looked at various problems of robots that need to navigate through an unknown environment in which there might be obstacles. And so some of our strategies employ what are called potential fields that are constructed that enforce a kind of attractive or repulsive effect on robots that changes with their distance from the obstacle, and potentially from the goal point. So here, now there's been work on what are called navigation functions that are defined over a known environment that can produce these potential-based control laws. Here, we're considering a case where the environment is unknown. In this case, we just know that the obstacles are convex, the environment is unbounded, and we want the robot to attain a target velocity while avoiding the obstacles. And we also don't want it to get stuck between obstacles. So the robot has no GPS. It can measure its own velocity heading and its minimum distance from obstacles in its local sensing range. So we devised a switching control scheme in which the robot uses a potential-based controller for the closest obstacle at each instant. And so we can prove that there are no local equilibria, including on the switching surface that between two obstacles, that is going to trap the robot. And so here's a video of a simulation. And so here we have some arbitrary obstacle field. The obstacles can be non-circular, just they're convex, and the robot can find its way through that obstacle field. And so it might have some oscillations or chattering around this switching surface, but we can prove that it's never going to get stuck on that switching surface. So we can also consider the case where the robot needs to converge to a target position. And again, it has to move through unknown obstacles. In this case, it has GPS, so it knows where it is in the environment. Again, the obstacles are convex. The robot can, in this case, measure its position as well as its velocity, heading, and minimum distance from the obstacles. And so we defined a new type of potential function that can be used in the controller. It functions somewhat like navigation functions, but it does not require knowledge of the obstacles and their locations and geometry. All right, so these were designed for a single robot with the potential future work that we could add multiple robots in those cases, potentially a team of robots that's moving an object through an obstacle field. So we also recently considered the case where you have multiple robots, they don't have GPS, and they have to move through a field of obstacles that can be static or they could be moving, not moving too fast, but still they can be moving. And we want to ensure that they can reach their target positions without colliding with anything. So here we have these restrictions on the robot's capabilities and information. Here they have LiDAR and odometry, and the approach that we used is a nonlinear model predictive control method that incorporates barrier functions, which describe the boundary between the safe and unsafe sets in which the robot can be. And the robots are learning the barrier functions using a deep neural network. So, and they're using only their own measurements to do that. So this is going to appear in IROS this year. Okay. So now I'll talk about some strategies that we've used for mapping environments, in particular mapping obstacles and features of interest. And so two approaches that we've used are based on the concept of consensus, in that we think about designing robots control policies such that they are sharing information with other robots, and we design this protocols in order to guarantee that all the robots will converge to the same information. And in this case, the information is a map of the environment, which is represented as an occupancy grid map. So the robots are exploring the environment, and they have local communication. So when robots are within a communication range, they can exchange their maps. In this case, the robots are following levee walks that are in which their heading is determined by a metric that maximizes new information. And they can measure their distance, for instance, using LiDAR to nearby objects. So we can show that the robots under a particular consensus-based protocol, that they will all converge to the same occupancy grid map over time. And so the robots, they can start out in different places. They'll have initially different maps with different unknown sections, as shown here in the simulation. And then as time goes on, they will converge to the same map. And so this is basically a dynamic consensus, so protocol. So it's time varying consensus, and we need an assumption that there's some connectivity requirements. So there's some time interval over which the network remains connected. So we also can relax that assumption about the connectivity and have no requirements. And we looked at a case where the robots move on a discrete grid according to a Markov chain. And so they just can move left, right, up, down. And here they're reconstructing a discrete distribution or a distribution of discrete features, which is also modeled as an occupancy grid map. So again, we use a consensus-based protocol based on distributed Chernoff fusion. And using that, we can show that eventually all the occupancy grid maps are going to converge to the same map. And again, in this case, we don't have any requirements on the communication network. So that's illustrated here. This was a simulation and simulation software in the loop with quadcopters. So the robots initially start with different estimates of the feature distribution, and then they converge to the same distribution. All right, so finally, I'm going to discuss some methods that we've developed for the problem of collective payload transport. So here we're thinking about robots that are interacting as a team with a large object or bulky object, and they have to cooperatively move that object to a target location or move it at a target velocity. So there are various applications for this task in different scenarios. And so for a survey on collective transport in multi-robot systems, we have this paper that just came out this year. So we're inspired by the behavior of group food retrieval in certain species of ants, because they've basically solved the problem of retrieving some large item as a team in a way that's scalable with the number of individuals. They're only relying on local information, such as responding to the tractive resistance of the load as it's being pulled around by other individuals. This species in particular, shown in the video, doesn't use pheromone trails to transport, although they use pheromones to recruit other ants to the food. And as you can see, they can move this this piece of food over rocky terrain and around plants, and so it's a very diverse types of environments, and they can get the food back to their nest. So in this case, the ants are likely using indirect communication through the load. They're not talking to each other in some way. And so we'd like to, in some of our strategies, we try to mimic this behavior in robots to accommodate the constraints that I've discussed earlier for robotic swarms. So some of our approaches use ant-inspired strategies, and in fact, strategies that are directly modeled from ant behaviors. Others of our strategies are not directly biomimetic, but they are rather bio-inspired. And so we consider robots that don't have communication. They don't know the environment beforehand, so they don't know about the payload or its geometry or weight, and they don't know about the robot team. They might not have GPS as well. So, so we developed a platform a while back for testing collective transport, and this platform is called Pheno. So we have Pheno with a gripper that has multiple degrees of freedom, and so we tested various capabilities of Pheno to move towards an object and orient itself in the correct position in order to grasp it, and then grasp and lift the object. So this was, these are some of our early experiments. And just to illustrate a possible setup of how we can do this with small, relatively inexpensive robot platforms. So, we looked at, we collaborated with some social insect researchers at ASU, including Stephen Pratt, and they had experimental data on ant colonies that retrieved different fake food items. So here, the food item is in fact a dime glued to a piece of foam, and the foam is smeared with fig paste so that the ants think that it's food. So given this experimental data, we developed a stochastic hybrid system model to describe the behaviors of the ants, both in terms of their transitions between different states and the dynamics of the ant load system together. And so we simulated, or we fit the parameters of our model to the experimental data to mimic the dynamics of the ant transport over time. And so we also used that model and adapted it using to our stochastic boundary coverage strategy, which I showed earlier. And so we designed the rules such that the robots had these ant-like rates of attaching and detaching, and that they could move the load to a specified velocity. And so in this way, we replicated some ant-like dynamics in the transport. We also looked at some other experimental data from our collaborators in which they basically enforced one directional motion of the transport to kind of simplify the process. And they did this by creating a raft of straws, and the ants are pulling, they can only pull this in this one direction to the left by pulling on these little threads. So what our collaborators observed is that if you changed the number of possible, if the ant population changed, so if you had 2, 3, or 4 ants, the ant team would end up moving at the speed of the slowest ant. And so we tried to model a mechanism by which this would happen and try to replicate it in our robots. And so we came up with this simple strategy that that illustrated that if the robots are moving with different maximum speeds, under this strategy, they would eventually converge to the speed of the slowest robot. So this, of course, this might not be the optimum strategy in a situation where you know the environment, like in a warehouse or a factory. You'd want to optimize, maybe optimize the speed or efficiency of the transport. But it might work well in unknown environments where there's a lot of uncertainty, and you want to preserve some of the robot's power so that they don't end up, burning out by pulling really fast. And so the whole team can still make progress, even though some are less capable than others. So finally, I'll talk a little bit about our other collective transport strategies. And so here, they're more loosely bio-inspired in that they kind of respect the same constraints, in that the robots are not communicating with each other, and they don't have information about the environment or the other robots. In this case, they don't have GPS. They're able to measure their velocity and heading, and their manipulator angle and angular velocity. So, so here we use a sliding mode control strategy that we can prove drives the system to the desired speed and heading in finite time. And so we can illustrate this with experiments as well as simulations. And the robots can be in any configuration around the payload. So we also developed an approach to use adaptive robot controllers for a system with uncertain mass parameters that stabilize the system again to a target velocity. And we also account for the holonomic constraints between the robots and payload. And we've also done some other work not shown here on collective transport in 3 dimensions, and also collective transport to a target position using a proportional derivative control strategy. And we looked at the effect of the distribution of robots around the load on the resulting error in the position and desired orientation. Okay, so so that concludes my talk on our control strategies for robotic swarms in uncertain environments. And I just wanted to briefly mention that we have we've done some additional research on some ongoing and soon concluding projects. We've looked at decentralized control of soft modular robotic arms that have distributed sensing and actuation. And these are inspired by octopus arm motions. And so we've developed strategies to basically to drive a soft multi-segmented robot arm into different configurations defined by bending, twisting, elongation, and shortening of deformations, as well as shear deformations shown here. And this was also validated on an experimental platform of a small robot arm with these hydrogel-based actuators that shrink and expand as the temperature changes. We also have an ongoing project on designing autonomous vehicle controllers that are designed in such a way that the responses they produce align with human values and moral priorities, especially in dynamic, unexpected situations like an unanticipated crash scenario. And so we've built a driving simulator, and we also have driving test beds, small scale driving test beds, in order to test out and develop our controllers. And so hopefully I'll have more to show about that as the project progresses. We also made this little robot car called the Go chart, which is in this IRS paper. Okay, so that concludes my talk. Thanks for your attention, and I will take any questions now.
Thank you, Spring, for the great talk. Let's open the stage for questions. So if you have questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask, or post it in the chat and I will read it for you. Maybe I'll break the ice with one. So actually very fascinating works touching a lot of different parts of the same field, let's say. Maybe one question I have is, since in the last slides you didn't really talk about the outlook, what do you think is the most complex problems out of all the ones you described? Because there's a lot of meat on the grill. What do you think is the most complex step forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think again the challenges is making sure that the swarm behaves in the expected manner over very long time periods, and in very uncertain environments. So we've here we've looked at, planar environments or graphs, but sometimes you might have different types of robots. You might have a heterogeneous swarm consisting of, ground and aerial and underwater robots that all have to interact with each other asynchronously over very long time scales. And they might, so you also have to develop a control architecture that can accommodate all these different platforms. And potentially another challenge is incorporating people into the swarm. So a human operator or teammate can be a member of the swarm, but the human has certain abilities and certain limitations, like cognitive limitations on how many agents they can keep track of at the same time. And so having a human in the loop is another ongoing challenge, which various research groups are looking at, including my collaborators at ASU. And of course, testing under real-world experimental conditions is a big challenge. Like a lot of these tests are done in laboratory environments or simulation, but they really need to be tested out in the field, where lots of things can go wrong, and lots of things can go wrong with a single robot. Now, if you have a swarm of robots, that's multiplying. So I think all of those are major challenges in this field.
Great, thank you. That was exhaustive.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No, in the good sense. And I now get a feeling of the next steps. Any other questions from the audience? Seems a shy audience today. Oh, actually, no. Mark has a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the autonomous vehicle planning that is aligned with human morale and priorities. If you could give us a small teaser as to the methods used in there, I'm really curious.
Yeah. So this project started at the beginning of this year, although we had previous other seed projects. So the idea is that we have a driving simulator and a physical driving test bed. This one on the bottom was developed by our colleague Lance Garavi, who's in the School in Theater, Dance, and Design, basically, and at ASU. And so we have a virtual and physical environment, and we will have participants at the university to drive through the virtual and physical courses. And so we'll collect data about that can characterize their driving behaviors. And we also give them surveys. So the lead on this project is psychology faculty member Catherine Johnson at ASU. And so we can characterize their values profiles according to these surveys, and then see if there is some connection with their driving behaviors as described by different controller parameters that govern the motion of the vehicle. So we're still sort of in the experimental setup finalization stage. And so then this fall we'll have some participants come and run through these experiments. And so we'll see, is there a difference in terms of controller design between people who have a more benevolent profile versus a more aggressive quote unquote power profile. And so you would be able to control, or the thought is you'd be able to design controllers for the vehicle to reflect these different types of values profiles, and the controller might produce similar behaviors to the driver, the human driver, in various scenarios, including crashes. Crash scenarios similar to like the classical trolley problem or variants on it. So that's our planned approach. Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm curious to see what comes out. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Any other question? I actually have one more I want to give the chance. It seems today people are a bit shy. Okay. Yeah, actually, the other thing that intrigued me quite a lot was this idea of also sharing, optimizing the shared resources or minimize resources or making some robots rest. How do you exactly model that? Because that actually applies to some things we are also looking at, in which you have fleets of vehicles that have shared capabilities, and sometimes you don't need all of them to do the same task if they can share information or share abilities. How do you really model this for the particular case you look at?
So modeling the different there are different power levels or different.
Yeah, exactly. Were you looking at computation power, simply power, energetics, or how did you do that?
Yeah, so we haven't explicitly modeled power, although that's an important question. Of course, I think the work with the ant transport, where they're basically towing a payload, the variation in capabilities kind of came out of the hypothesis that the ants were accommodating the slowest ant, because so oftentimes we imagine a swarm to be a set of identical agents, but in fact they're not going to be. They'll have different power. Some are more charged than others, or some might be different types of platforms. But it just seemed that hypothesis was consistent with the observations of the speed of the payload with the variation in number of robots. So we didn't I guess we ended up explicitly modeling that in the experiment, because the robots had different maximum speeds. But of course, a lot more can be done on that. And I think there's been other work like Magnus Egerstedt's work on robot ecology and the sloth robots, and there's definitely observations of ant colonies where a lot of the ants are idle a lot of the time, like work by Anna Dornhaus at University of Arizona. So we definitely see it in nature, like there's a large proportion of the ants can be idle at any given time. That serves some function. Maybe you don't want like the area they're working in to get too crowded, or that's going to decrease their productivity. But I think the short answer is we haven't really modeled it, but it's definitely an important question. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. All right. I think we can let you start your day. Thank you again very much for the talk, and I wish you good luck for the next steps.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
I will share the video with you as soon as I edited it and uploaded it.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you again.
Thanks.
And thank you all for participating. See you all next week for the next talk. Bye.
Bye.